これでいいかな？安定はしてるのかな？はい、安定してます。それでは、本読みに入りましょう。前回までは、これでした。ミス・ケントンとスティーブンズ。スティーブンズはまだご主人様の会議を見張ってた。そうそう。ここから始まるね。When I returned to the library a moment later, Mr. Cardinal was wandering around the shelves, scrutinizing spines. I could see papers scattered untidily over one of the writing desks nearby. As I approached, Mr. Cardinal made an appreciative sound and slumped down into a leather armchair. I went over to him, poured a little brandy, and handed it to him. "You know, Stevens," he said, "we've been friends for some time now, haven't we?" "Indeed, sir. I always look forward to a little chat with you whenever I come here." "Yes, sir. Won't you care to join me in a little drink?" "That's very kind of you, sir, but no. Thank you, I won't." "I say, Stevens, are you all right there?" "Perfectly all right, thank you, sir," I said with a small laugh. "Not feeling unwell, are you?" "A little tired, perhaps, but I'm perfectly fine, thank you, sir." "Well, then, you should sit down. Anyway, as I was saying, we've been friends for some time, so I really ought to be truthful with you. As you no doubt guessed, I didn't happen by tonight just by accident. I had a tip-off, you see, about what's going on over there across the hall at this very moment." "Yes, sir." "I do wish you'd sit down, Stevens. I want us to talk as friends. And you're standing there holding that blasted tray looking like you're about to wander off any second." "I'm sorry, sir." I put down my tray and seated myself in an appropriate posture on the armchair Mr. Cardinal was indicating. "That's better," Mr. Cardinal said. "Now, Stevens, I don't suppose the Prime Minister is presently in the drawing room, is he?" "Prime Minister, sir?" "Oh, it's all right, you don't have to tell me. I understand you're in a tricky position." Mr. Cardinal heaved a sigh and looked wearily towards his papers scattered over the desk. Then he said, "I hardly need to tell you, do I, Stevens, what I feel towards his lordship? I mean to say, he's been like a second father to me." "I hardly need to tell you, Stevens." "No, sir. I care deeply for him." "Yes, sir. And I know you do too. Care deeply for him, don't you, Stevens?" "I do indeed, sir." "Good. So we both know where we stand. Let's face facts. His lordship is in deep waters. I've watched him swimming further and further out, and let me tell you, I'm getting very anxious. He's out of his depth, you see, Stevens." "Is that so, sir?" "Stevens, do you know what is happening at this very moment as we sit here, talking? What's happening just several yards from us? Over in that room, and I don't need to confirm it, there is gathered at this moment the British Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the German Ambassador. His lordship has worked wonders to bring this meeting about, and he faithfully believes, he's doing something good and honorable. Do you know why his lordship has brought these gentlemen here tonight? Do you know, Stevens, what is going on here? I'm afraid not. You're afraid not. Tell me, Stevens, don't you care at all? Aren't you curious? Good God, man. Something very crucial is going on in this house. Aren't you at all curious? It is not my place to be curious about such matters, sir. But you care about his lordship. You care deeply. You just told me that. If you care about his lordship, shouldn't you be concerned? At least a little curious? The British Prime Minister and the German ambassador are brought together by your employer for secret talks in the night, and you're not even curious. I would not say I am not curious, sir. However, it is not my position to display curiosity about such matters. It's not your position. Ah, I suppose you believe that to be loyalty, do you? You think that's being loyal to his lordship or to the crown? Come to that? I'm sorry, sir, I fail to see what it is you are proposing. Mr. Cardinal sighed again and shook his head. I'm not proposing anything, Stevens. Quite frankly, I don't know what's to be done, but you might at least be curious. He was silent for a moment, during which time he seemed to be gazing emptily at the area of carpet around my feet. Sure you won't join me in a drink, Stevens, he said eventually. No, thank you, sir. I'll tell you this, Stevens. His lordship is being made a fool of. I've done a lot of investigating. I know the situation in Germany now as well as anyone in this country. But I tell you... Ah, 初コメありがとう。ペリーノさん、来てくれてありがとう。いらっしゃい。今日は本読み配信です。英語ですが、ゆっくりしていてくださいね。どこだっけ? Sure you won't join me in a drink, Stevens, he said eventually. No, thank you, sir. I'll tell you this, Stevens. Yeah, 母国語は英語ではないです。母国に近いものですね。私はね、パキスタン人です。あ、こんにちは。居眠り猫さん、来てくれてありがとう。いらっしゃい。今は本読んでます。よければゆっくりしててください。I'll tell you this, Stevens. His lordship is being made a fool of. I've done a lot of investigating. I know the situation in Germany as well as anyone in this country, and I tell you, his lordship is being made a fool of. I gave no reply, and Mr. Cardinal went on gazing emptily at the floor. After a while, he continued. His lordship is a dear, dear man, but the fact is he is out of his depth. He is being maneuvered. The Nazis are maneuvering him like a pawn. Have you noticed this, Stephen? Have you noticed this is what has been happening for the last 3 or 4 years at least? I'm sorry, sir. I've failed to notice any such development. Ah, 日本語でも話せるけど、質問があれば言ってくださいね。できる限り答えます。Haven't you even had a suspicion, the smallest suspicion, that Herr Hitler, through our dear friend Herr Ribbentrop, has been maneuvering his lordship like a pawn, just as easily as he maneuvers any of his other pawns back in Berlin? I'm sorry, sir. I'm afraid I have not noticed any such development. But I suppose you wouldn't, even because you're not curious. You just let all this go on before you, and you never think to look at it for what it is. Mr. Cardinal adjusted his position in his armchair so that he was a little more upright, and for a moment he seemed to be contemplating his unfinished work on the desk nearby. Then he said, His lordship is a gentleman, That's what's at the root of it. He's a gentleman, and he fought a war with the Germans. And it's his instinct to offer generosity and friendship to a defeated foe. It's his instinct because he's a gentleman. A true old English gentleman, and you must have seen it, Stevens. How could you not have seen it? The way they've used it, manipulated it, turned something fine and noble into something else, something they can use for their own foul ends. You must have seen it, Stevens. Mr. Cardinal was once again staring at the floor. He remained silent for a few moments, then he said, I remember coming here years ago, and there was this American chap here. We were having a big conference. My father was involved in organizing it. I remember this American chap, even drunker than I am now. He got up at the dinner table in front of the whole company, and he pointed at his lordship and called him an amateur. Called him a bungling amateur, and that he was out of his depth. Well, I have to say, Stevens, the American chap was quite right. It's a fact of life. Today's world is too foul a place for fine and noble instincts. You've seen it yourself, haven't you, Stevens? The way they've manipulated something fine and noble. You've seen it yourself, haven't you? あ、ドンちゃん来てくれてありがとう。あ、もう使ってくれてありがとう。どうですか？かわいいでしょ？いらっしゃい。本読んでますから、ゆっくりしててね。Can't say you have. I'm sorry, sir, but I can't say I have. ありがとう。かわいいですね。I'm sorry, sir, but I can't say I have. You can't say you have. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm going to do something about it. If father were alive, he would do something to stop it. Mr. Cardinal fell silent again, and for a moment perhaps, it was to do with his having evoked memories of his late father. He looked extremely melancholy. Are you content, Stevens? He said finally, to watch his lordship go over the precipice just like that? I'm sorry, sir, I don't fully understand what it is you're referring to. You don't understand, Stevens? Well, we're friends, and so I'll put it to you frankly. Over the last few years, his lordship has probably been the single most useful pawn Herr Hitler has had in this country for his propaganda tricks. All the better because he's sincere and honorable and doesn't recognize the true nature of what he's doing. During the last 3 years alone, his lordship has been crucially instrumental in establishing links between Berlin and over 60 of the most influential citizens of this country. あ、ノーブルさん、かわいいスタンプですね。なんですね。Gaming 1958ペンラ。誰かのチャンネルのものらしいですね。かわいい。かわいいスタンプ。ありがとう。No, I don't. I'm sorry, sir. I don't fully understand what it is you're referring to. あ、そう。どこだっけ? Inflation of citizens of this country. It's worked beautifully for them. Herr Ribbentrop's been able to virtually bypass our foreign office altogether. And as if their wretched rally and their wretched Olympic Games weren't enough, do you know what they've got his lordship working on now? Do you have any idea what it is? What is being discussed now? I'm afraid not, sir. His lordship has been trying to persuade the Prime Minister himself to accept an invitation to visit Herr Hitler. He really believes there's a terrible misunderstanding on the Prime Minister's part concerning the present German regime. I cannot see what there is to object to in that, sir. His lordship has always striven to aid better understanding between nations. And that's not all, Stevens. At this very moment, unless I am very much mistaken, at this very moment, his lordship is discussing the idea of His Majesty himself visiting Herr Hitler. It's hardly a secret our new king has always been an enthusiast for the Nazis. Well, apparently he's now keen to accept Herr Hitler's invitation. At this very moment, Stevens, his lordship is doing what he can to remove Foreign Office objections to this appalling idea. I'm sorry, sir, but I cannot see that his lordship is doing anything other than that which is highest and noblest. He is doing what he can, after all, to ensure that peace will continue to prevail in Europe. Tell me, Stevens, aren't you struck by even the remote possibility that I am correct? Are you not at least curious about what I'm saying? I am sorry, sir, but I have to say that I have every trust in his lordship's good judgment. No one with good judgment could persist in believing anything Herr Hitler says after the Rhineland, Stevens. His lordship is out of his depth. Oh dear. Now I have really offended you. Not at all, sir, I said, for I had risen on hearing the bell from the drawing room. I appear to be required by the gentleman. Please excuse me. In the drawing room, the air was thick with tobacco smoke indeed. The distinguished gentlemen continued to smoke their cigars, solemn expressions on their faces, not uttering a word, while his lordship instructed me to bring up a certain exceptionally fine bottle of port from the cellar. At such a time of night, one's footsteps descending the back staircase are bound to be conspicuous, and no doubt they were responsible for arousing Miss Kenton. For as I was making my way along the darkness of the corridor, the door to her parlour opened, and she appeared at the threshold, illuminated by the light from within. "I am surprised to find you still down here, Miss Kenton," I said as I approached. "Mr. Stevens, I was very foolish earlier on. Excuse me, Miss Kenton, but I have not time to talk just now." "Mr. Stevens, you mustn't take anything I said earlier to heart. I was simply being foolish." "I have not taken anything you have said to heart, Miss Kenton. In fact, I cannot recall what it is you might be referring to. Events of great importance are unfolding upstairs, and I can hardly stop to exchange pleasantries with you. I would suggest you retire for the night." With that, I hurried on, and it was not until I had all but reached the kitchen doors that the darkness, falling again in the corridors, told me Miss Kenton had closed her parlour door. It did not take me long to locate the bottle in question, down in the cellar, and to make the necessary preparations for its serving. It was then only a few minutes after my short encounter with Miss Kenton that I found myself walking down the corridor again on my return journey, this time bearing a tray. As I approached Miss Kenton's door, I saw from the light seeping through its sleeping around its edges that she was still within, and that was the moment I am now sure that had remained so persistently lodged in my memory. That moment as I paused in the dimness of the corridor, the tray in my hands, an ever-growing conviction mounting within me that just a few yards away, on the other side of that door, Miss Kenton was at that moment crying. As I recall, there was no real evidence to account for this conviction. I had certainly not heard any sounds of crying, and yet I remember being quite certain that were I to knock and enter, I would discover her in tears. I do not know how long I remained there. At the time it seemed a significant period, but in reality I suspect it was only a matter of a few seconds. For, of course, I was required to hurry upstairs to serve some of the most distinguished gentlemen of the land, and I cannot imagine I would have delayed unduly. When I returned to the drawing room, I saw that the gentlemen were still in a rather serious mood. Beyond this, however, I had little chance to gain any impression of the atmosphere, for no sooner had I entered than his lordship was taking the tray from me, saying, "Thank you, Stevens. I'll see to it. That'll be all." Crossing the hall again, I took up my usual position beneath the arch, and for the next hour or so until, that is, the gentlemen finally departed, no event occurred which obliged me to move from my spot. Nevertheless, that hour I spent standing there has stayed very vividly in my mind throughout the years. At first, my mood was, I do not mind admitting it, somewhat downcast. But then, as I continued to stand there, a curious thing began to take place. That is to say, a deep feeling of triumph started to well up within me. I cannot remember to what extent I analyzed this feeling at the time, but today, looking back on it, it does not seem so difficult to account for. I had, after all, just come through an extremely trying evening, throughout which I had managed to persevere a dignity in keeping with my position, and had done so, moreover, in a manner even my father might have been proud of. And there, across the hall, behind the very doors upon which my gaze was then resting, within the very room where I had just executed my duties, the most powerful gentlemen of Europe were conferring over the fate of our continent. Who would doubt at that moment that I had indeed come as close to the great hub of things as any butler could wish? I would suppose, then, that as I stood there pondering the events of the evening, those that had unfolded, and those that still in the process of doing so, they appeared to me a sort of summary of all that I had come to achieve thus far in my life. I can see few other explanations for that sense of triumph. I came to be uplifted by that night. Day 6, evening. Weymouth. Weymouth. This seaside town is a place I have thought of this seaside town is a place I have thought of coming to for many years. I have heard various people talk of having spent a pleasant holiday here, and Mrs. Simmons, too, in The Wonder of England, calls it a town that can keep the visitor fully entertained for many days on end. In fact, she makes a special mention of this pier, upon which I have been promenading for the past half hour, recommending particularly that it be visited in the evening when it becomes lit up.そう、喋れるね。ごめん、ちょっと翻訳してもらった。そう、母国語も英語も日本語も喋れるとすごすぎ、いや、すごすぎではない。普通に歴史的に見れば、一個増やしただけ、日本語だけで。英語も、ウルドゥ語も、生まれから始めたから、それだけです。そうですね。When it becomes lit up with bulbs of various colors. A moment ago, I learned from an official that the lights would be switched on fairly soon, and so I have decided to sit down here on this bench and await the event. I have a good view from here of the sun setting over the sea, and though there is still plenty of daylight left, it has been a splendid day. I can see here and there light starting to come on all along the shore. Meanwhile, the pier remains busy with people. Behind me, the drumming of numerous footsteps upon these boards continues without interruption. I arrived at this town yesterday afternoon and have decided to remain a second night here so as to allow myself this whole day to spend in a leisurely manner. And I must say it has been something of a relief not to be motoring. For enjoyable though the activity can be, one can also get a little weary of it after a while. In any case, I can well afford the time to remain this further day here. An early start tomorrow will ensure that I am back at Darlington Hall by tea time. It is now fully 2 days since my meeting with Miss Kenton. the tea lounge of the Rose Garden Hotel in Little Compton. For indeed, that was where we met. Ah, フォローありがとう、ヤスさん。来てくれてありがとう。先ほどは楽しかった。It is now fully 2 days since my meeting with Miss Kenton in the tea lounge of the Rose Garden Hotel in Little Compton. For indeed, that was where we met, Miss Kenton, surprising me by coming to the hotel. I had been whiling away some time after finishing my lunch. I was, I believe, simply staring at the rain from the window by my table, when a member of the hotel staff had come to inform me that a lady was wishing to see me at the reception. I rose and went out into the lobby where I could see no one I recognized, but then the receptionist had said from behind her counter, "The lady's in the tea lounge, sir." Going in through the door indicated, I discovered a room filled with ill-matching armchairs and occasional tables. There was no one else present other than Miss Kenton, who rose as I entered, smiled and held out her hand to me. "Ah, Mr. Stevens, how nice to see you again." "Mrs. Ben, how lovely." The light in the room was extremely gloomy on account of the rain, and so we moved 2 armchairs up close to the bay window. And that was how Miss Kenton and I talked for the next 2 hours or so. "Ah, やっさん、初コメありがとう。はい。よろしくお願いします." And that was how Miss Kenton and I talked for the next 2 hours or so. There in the pool of grey light, while the rain continued to fall steadily on the square outside. She had naturally aged somewhat, but my eyes at least, she seemed to have done so very gracefully. Her figure remained slim, her posture as upright as ever. She had maintained to her old way of holding her head in a manner that verged on the defiant. Of course, with the bleak light falling on her face, I could hardly help but notice the lines that had appeared here and there, but by and large, Miss Kenton I saw before me looked surprisingly similar to the person who had inhabited my memory over these years. That is to say, it was, on the whole, extremely pleasing to see her again. For the first 20 minutes or so, I would say we exchanged the sort of remarks strangers might. She inquired politely about my journey thus far, how I was enjoying my holiday, which towns and landmarks I had visited, and so on. As we continued to talk, I must say I thought I began to notice further, more subtle changes which the years had brought on her. For instance, Miss Kenton appeared somehow slower. It is possible this was simply the calmness that comes with age, and I did try for some time to see it as such, but I could not escape the feeling that what I was really seeing was a weariness with life. The spark which had once made her such a lively and at times volatile person seemed now to have gone. In fact, every now and then, when she was not speaking, when her face was in repose, I thought I glimpsed something like sadness in her expression. But then again, I may well have been mistaken about this. After a little while, what little awkwardness has existed during the initial minutes of our meeting had dissipated completely, and our conversation took a more personal turn. We spent some time reminiscing about various persons from the past, or else exchanging any news we had concerning them. And this was, I must say, most enjoyable. But it was not so much the content of our conversation as the little smiles she gave at the end of her utterances. Her small ironic inflections here and there, certain gestures with her shoulders or her hands, which began to recall unmistakably the rhythms and habits of our conversation from all those years ago. It was around this point also that I was able to establish some facts concerning her present circumstances. For instance, I learned that her marriage was not in quite as parlous a state as it might have been supposed from her letter, that although she had indeed left her home for a period of 4 or 5 years, during which time the letter I received had been composed. She had returned home, and Mr. Ben had been very pleased to have her back. It's just as well one of us is sensible about these things, he said with a smile. I am aware, of course, that such matters were hardly any of my business. I should make clear I would not have dreamt of prying into these areas were it not that I did have, you might recall, important professional reasons for doing so. That is to say, in respect to the present staffing problems at Darlington Hall. In any case, Miss Kenton did not seem to mind at all confiding in me over these matters, and I took this as a pleasing testimony to the strength of the close working relationship we had once had. For a little while after that, I recall, Miss Kenton went on talking more generally about her husband, who was to retire soon, a little early on account of poor health, and of her daughter who was now married and expecting a child in the autumn. ちょっと広告入りますね。ちょっと水とか飲んでくださいね。私も作ります。飲み物。
待たせしました。ただいま。
Who is now married and expecting a child.
帰りありがとう、のんちゃん。
Who is now married and expecting a child in the autumn. In fact, Miss Kenton gave me her daughter's address in Dorset, and I must say I was rather flattered to see how keen she was that I call in on my return journey. Although I explained that it was unlikely I would pass through that part of Dorset, Miss Kenton continued to press me, saying, "Catherine's heard all about you, Mr. Stevens. She'd be so thrilled to meet you." For my own part, I tried to describe to her as best I could the Darlington Hall of today. I attempted to convey to her what a genial employee Mr. Faraday is, and I described the changes to the house itself, the alterations and the dust sheeting, as well as the present staffing arrangements. Miss Kenton, I thought, became visibly happier when I talked about the house, and soon we were recollecting together various old memories, frequently laughing over them. Only once do I recall our touching upon Lord Darlington. We had been enjoying some recollection or other concerning young Mr. Cardinal, that I was then obliged to go on to inform Miss Kenton of the gentleman being killed in Belgium during the war. And I had gone on to say, of course, his lordship was very fond of Mr. Cardinal and took it very badly. I did not wish to spoil the pleasant atmosphere with unhappy talk, so I tried to leave the topic again almost immediately. But as I had feared, Miss Kenton had read of the unsuccessful libel action and inevitably took the opportunity to probe me a little. As I recall, I rather resisted being drawn in, though in the end I did say to her that the fact is, Mrs. Ben, throughout the war, some truly terrible things had been said about his lordship. And by that newspaper in particular, he bore it all, while the country remained in peril. But once the war was over, and the insinuation simply continued, well, his lordship saw no reason to go on suffering in silence. It's easy enough to see now, perhaps, all the dangers of going to court just at that time. What with the climate as it was, but there you are. His lordship sincerely believed he would get justice. Instead, of course, the newspaper simply increased its circulation, and his lordship's good name was destroyed forever. Really, Mrs. Ben afterwards. Well, his lordship was virtually an invalid, and the house became so quiet I would take him tea in the drawing room, and, well, it really was most tragic to see. I'm very sorry, Mr. Stevens. I had no idea things had been so bad. Oh yes, Mrs. Ben, but enough of this. I know you remember Darlington Hall in the days when there were great gatherings, when it was filled with distinguished visitors. Now that's the way his lordship deserves to be remembered. As I say, that was the only time we mentioned Lord Darlington. Predominantly, we concerned ourselves with very happy memories, and those 2 hours we spent together in the tea lounge were, I would say, extremely pleasant ones. I seem to remember various guests coming in while we were talking, sitting down for a few moments, and leaving again, but they did not distract us in any way at all. Indeed, one could barely believe 2 whole hours had elapsed when Miss Kenton looked up at the clock on the mantel-shelf and said she would have to be returning home. On establishing that she would have to walk in the rain to a bus stop a little way out of the village, I insisted on running her there in the Ford. And so it was that after obtaining an umbrella from the reception desk, we stepped outside together. Large puddles had formed on the ground around where I had left the Ford, and so it was that afterwards obliging me to assist Miss Kenton a little to allow her to reach the passenger door. Soon, however, we were motoring down the village high street, and then the shops had gone, and we found ourselves in open country. Miss Kenton, who had been sitting quietly, watching the passing view, turned to me at this point, saying, "What are you smiling to yourself about like that, Mr. Stevens?" "Oh, you must excuse me, Mrs. Benn, but I was just recalling certain things you wrote in your letter. I was a little worried when I read them, but I see now I had little reason to be." "Oh, what things in particular do you mean, Mr. Stevens?" "Oh, nothing in particular, Mrs. Benn." "Oh, Mr. Stevens, you really must tell me." "Well, for instance, Mrs. Benn," I said with a laugh, "at one point in your letter you write, now let me see, the rest of my life stretches out like an emptiness before me. Some words to that effect." "Really, Mr. Stevens," she said, also laughing a little, "I couldn't have written any such thing." "Oh, I assure you, you did, Mrs. Benn. I recall it very clearly." "Oh dear. Well, perhaps there are some days when I feel like that, but they pass quickly enough, let me assure you, Mr. Stevens. My life does not stretch out emptily before me. For one thing, we are looking forward to the grandchild, the first of a few, perhaps." "Yes, indeed, that will be splendid for you." We drove on quietly for a few further moments. Then Miss Kenton said, "And what about you, Mr. Stevens? What does the future hold for you back at Darlington Hall?" "Well, whatever awaits me, Mrs. Benn, I know I'm not awaited by emptiness. If only I were. But oh no, there's work, work, and more work." We both laughed at this. Then Miss Kenton pointed out a bus shelter visible further up the road as we approached it. She said, "Will you wait with me, Mr. Stevens? The bus will only be a few minutes." The rain was still falling steadily as we got out of the car and hurried towards the shelter. This latter, a stone construct complete with a tiled roof, looked very sturdy, as indeed it needed to be, standing as it did in a highly exposed position against the background of empty fields. Against, against a background of empty fields. Inside, the paint was peeling everywhere, but the place was clean enough. Miss Kenton seated herself on a bench provided, while I remained on my feet where I could command a view of the approaching bus. On the other side of the road, all I could see were more farm fields. A line of telegraph poles led my eye over them into the far distance. After we had been waiting in silence for a few minutes, I finally brought myself to say, "Excuse me, Mrs. Benn, but the fact is we may not meet again for a long time. I wonder if you would perhaps permit me to ask you something of a rather personal order. It is something that has been troubling me for some time." "Certainly, Mr. Stevens. We are old friends after all." "Indeed, as you say, we are old friends. I simply wish to ask you, Mrs. Benn. Please do not reply if you feel you shouldn't. But the fact is, the letters I have had from you over the years, and in particular the last letter, have tended to suggest that you are, how might one put it, rather unhappy. I simply wondered if you were being ill-treated in some way." "Ill-treated in some way." Forgive me, but as I say, it is something that has worried me for some time. I would feel foolish had I come all this way and seen you, and not at least asked you. "Mr. Stevens, there's no need to be so embarrassed. We're old friends after all, are we not? In fact, I'm very touched you should be so concerned, and I can put your mind at rest on this matter absolutely. My husband does not mistreat me at all in any way. He is not in the least a cruel or ill-tempered man. I must say, Mrs. Benn, that does take a load from my mind." I leaned forward into the rain, looking for signs of the bus. "I can see you are not very satisfied, Mr. Stevens. Do you not believe me?" "Oh, it's not that, Mrs. Benn, not that at all. It's just that the fact remains you do not seem to have been very happy over the years. That is to say, forgive me."
You have taken it on yourself to leave your husband on a number of occasions. If he does not mistreat you, then, well, one is rather mystified as to the cause of your unhappiness.
I looked out into the drizzle again.
Eventually, I heard Miss Kenton say behind me, Mr. Stevens, how can I explain? I hardly know myself why I do such things. It's true, I've left 3 times now. She paused a moment, during which time I continued to gaze out towards the fields on the other side of the road. Then she said, I suppose, Mr. Stevens, you're asking whether or not I love my husband. Really, Mrs. Ben, I would hardly presume. I feel I should answer you, Mr. Stevens, as you say, we may not meet again for many years. Yes, I do love my husband. I didn't at first. I didn't at first for a long time. When I left Darlington Hall all those years ago, I never realized I was really truly leaving. I believe I thought of it as simply another ruse, Mr. Stevens, to annoy you. It was a shock to come out here and find myself married for a long time. I was very unhappy indeed. But then year after year went by. There was the war. Catherine grew up. One day I realized I loved my husband. You spend so much time with someone you find you get used to. He's a kind, steady man, and yes, Mr. Stevens, I've grown to love him. Miss Kenton fell silent again for a moment. Then she went on. But that doesn't mean to say, of course, there aren't occasions now and then, extremely desolate occasions, when you think to yourself, what a terrible mistake I've made with my life. When you get to thinking about a different life, a better life you might have had, for instance. I got to thinking about a life I may have had with you, Mr. Stevens, and I suppose that's when I get angry over some silly little thing and leave. And each time I do so, I realize before long, my rightful place is with my husband. After all, there's no turning back the clock now. One can't be forever dwelling on what might have been. One should realize one has as good as must, perhaps better, and be grateful. I do not think I responded immediately, for it took me a moment or two to fully digest those words of Miss Kenton. Moreover, as you might appreciate, their implications, such as to provoke a certain degree of sorrow within me. Indeed, why should I not admit it? At that moment my heart was breaking. Before long, however, I turned to her and said with a smile, You're very correct, Miss Ben. As you say, it is too late to turn back the clock. Indeed, I would not be able to rest if I thought such ideas were the cause of unhappiness for you and your husband. You must, each of us, as you point out, be grateful for what we do have. And from what you tell me, Mrs. Ben, you have reason to be contented. In fact, I would venture, what with Mr. Ben retiring, and with grandchildren on the way, that you and Mr. Ben, some extremely happy years before you, you really mustn't let any more foolish ideas come between yourself and the happiness you deserve. Of course, you're right, Mr. Stevens. You're so kind. Ah, Mrs. Ben, that appears to be the bus coming now. I stepped outside and signaled, while Miss Kenton rose and came to the edge of the shelter. Only as the bus pulled up and I glanced at Miss Kenton and perceived that her eyes had filled with tears, I smiled and said, Now, Mrs. Ben, you must take good care of yourself. Many say retirement is the best part of life for a married couple. You must do all you can to make these years happy ones for yourself and your husband. We may never meet again, Mrs. Ben, so I would ask you to take good heed of what I am saying. I will, Mr. Stevens, thank you, and thank you for the lift. It was so very kind of you. It was so nice to see you again. It was a great pleasure to see you again, Ben. The air lights have been switched on, and behind me a crowd of people have just given a loud cheer to greet this event. There's still plenty of daylight left. The sky over the sea has turned a pale red, but it would seem that all these people who have been gathering on this pier for the past half hour are now willing the night to fall. This confirms very aptly, I suppose, the point made by the man who until a little while ago was sitting here beside me on this bench, and with whom I had my curious discussion. His claim was that for a great many people, the evening was the best part of the day, the part they looked most look forward to. And as I say, there would appear to be some truth in this assertion. For why else would all these people have a spontaneous cheer simply because the pier lights have come on? Of course, the man had been speaking figuratively, but it is rather interesting to see his words born out of so immediately at the literal level. I would suppose he had been sitting here next to me for some minutes without my noticing him. So absorbed had I become with my recollections of meeting with Miss Kenton 2 days ago. In fact, I do not think I registered his presence on the bench at all until he declared out loud, "Sea air does you a lot of good." I looked up and saw a heavily built man, probably in his late 60s, wearing a rather tired tweed jacket, his shirt open at the neck. He was gazing out over the water, perhaps at some seagulls in the far distance, and so it was not at all clear that he had been talking to me. But since no one else responded, and since I could see no other obvious persons close by who might do so, I eventually said, "Yes, I'm sure it does. The doctor says it does good. It does you good, so I come up here, as much as the weather will let me." The man went on to tell me about his various ailments, only very occasionally turning his eyes away from the sunset in order to give me a good nod or a grin. I really only started to pay any attention at all, when he happened to mention that until his retirement 3 years ago, he had been a butler of a nearby house. On inquiring further, I ascertained that the house had been a very small one, in which he had been the only full-time employee. And I asked him if he had ever worked with a proper staff under him. "Perhaps before the war," he replied. "Oh, in those days I was just a footman. I wouldn't have had the know-how to be a butler in those days." You'd be surprised what it involved when you had those big houses you had then. At this point, I thought it appropriate to reveal my identity, and although I'm not sure Darlington Hall meant anything to him, my companion seemed suitably impressed. "And here I was trying to explain it all to you," he said with a laugh. "Good job you told me when you did, before I made a right fool of myself. Just shows you never know who you're addressing when you start talking to a stranger." "So you had a big staff, I suppose, before the war, I mean?" He was a cheerful fellow and seemed genuinely interested, so I confess I did spend a little time telling him about Darlington Hall in former days. In the main, I tried to convey to him some of the know-how, as he put it, involved in overseeing large events of the sort we used often to have. Indeed, I believe I even revealed to him several of my professional secrets, designed to bring that extra bit out of staff, as well as the various sleights of hand, the equivalent of a conjurer's, by which a butler could cause a thing to occur at just the right time and place without guests even glimpsing the often large and complicated maneuver behind the operation. As I say, the companion seemed genuinely interested. After a time I felt I had revealed enough, and so concluded by saying, "Of course things are quite different today under my present employer. An American gentleman." "American, eh? Well, they're the only ones who can afford it now. So you stayed on with the house, part of the package." He turned and gave me a grin. "Yes," I said, laughing a little. "As you say, part of the package." man turned his gaze back to the sea again, took a deep breath and sighed contentedly. We then proceeded to sit there together quietly for several moments. The fact is, of course, I said after a while, I gave my best to Lord Darlington. I gave him the very best I had to give. And now, well, I find I do not have a great deal more left to give. ちょっと待ってね、電話が来てる。電話が来ちゃって。どこだっけ？ The man said nothing, but nodded, so I went on. Since my new employer, Mr. Faraday, arrived, I tried very hard indeed to provide the sort of service I would like him to have. I've tried and tried, but whatever I do, I find I am far from reaching the standards I once set myself. More and more errors are appearing in my work, quite trivial in themselves. At least so far, but they're of the sort I would never have made before. And I know what they signify. Goodness knows, I've tried and tried, but it's no use. I've given what I've had to give. I gave it all to Lord Darlington. Oh dear, mate. Here, you want a hanky? I've got one somewhere. Here we are. It's fairly clean. Just blew my nose once this morning. That's all. Have a go, mate. Oh dear, no, thank you. It's quite all right. I'm very sorry. I'm afraid that traveling has me tired. I'm very sorry. You must have been very attached to this Lord whatever. And it's 3 years since he passed away, you say? I can see you were very attached to him, mate. Lord Darlington wasn't a bad man. He wasn't a bad man at all, and at least he had the privilege of being able to see, at the end of his life, that he made his own mistakes. Made his own mistakes. His lordship was a courageous man. He chose a certain path in life. It proved to be a misguided one. But there, he chose it. He can say that at least. As for myself, I cannot even claim that. You see, I trusted in his lordship's wisdom all the years I served him. I trusted I was doing something worthwhile. Can't even say I made my own mistakes, really. One has to ask oneself, what dignity is there in that? Now look, mate, I'm not sure I follow everything you say, but if you ask me, your attitude's all wrong, you see. Don't keep looking back all the time. You're bound to get depressed. And alright, you can't do your job as well as you used to, but it's the same for all of us, see? We've all got to put our feet up at some point. Look at me, been happy as a lark since the day I retired. Alright, so neither of us are exactly in our first flush of youth. But you've got to keep looking forward. And I believe it was then that I said, you've got to enjoy yourself. The evening's the best part of the day. You've done your day's work. Now you can put your feet up and enjoy it. That's how I look at it. Ask anybody. They'll all tell you the evening's the best part of the day. I'm sure you're quite correct, I said. I'm so sorry. This is so unseemly. I suspect I'm overtired.
I've been traveling rather a lot, you see. It is now some 20 minutes since the man left, but I have maintained here on this bench. Wait the event that has just taken place, namely the switching on of their lights. As I say, the happiness with which the pleasure seeker gathering on this pier greeted the small event would tend to vouch for the correctness of my companion's word. For a great many people, this evening is the most enjoyable part of the day. Perhaps then there is something to his advice that I should. I'm looking back so. Ah, 眠くなってきたからゆっくり寝てってもいい。そうですね。Perhaps there is something to say to his advice that I should cease looking back so much, that I should adopt a more positive outlook and try to make the best of what remains of my day. After all, what can we ever gain in forever looking back and blaming ourselves if our lives have not turned out quite as wished? The hard reality is, surely, that for the likes of you and I, there is little choice other than to leave our fate, ultimately, in the hands of those great gentlemen at the hub of this world, what employ our services. What is the point in worrying oneself too much about what one could or one could not have? Control the course one's life took. Surely it is enough that the likes of you and I at least try to make our small contribution count for something true and worthy. And if some of us are prepared to sacrifice much in life in order to pursue such aspirations, surely that is in itself, whatever the outcome, cause for pride and contentment. A few moments ago, incidentally, shortly after the lights came on, I did turn on my bench a moment to study more closely these throngs of people laughing and chatting behind me. There are people of all ages strolling around this pier, families with children, couples, young and elderly, walking arm in arm. There is a group of 6 or 7 people gathered a little way behind me, who have aroused my curiosity a little. I naturally assumed that they were a group of friends out together for the evening. But as I listened to their exchange, it became apparent that strangers who had just happened upon one another here in this spot behind me. Evidently they had all paused a moment for the lights coming on and then proceeded all into conversation with one another. As I watch them now, they are laughing together merrily. It is curious how people can build such warmth among themselves so swiftly. It is possible these particular persons are simply united by the anticipation of the evening ahead. But then I rather fancy it has more to do with the skill of bantering. Listening to them now, I can hear them exchanging one bantering remark after another. It is, I would suppose, the way many people like to proceed. In fact, it is possible my bench companion of a while ago expected me to banter with him, in which case I suppose I was of a sorry disappointment. Perhaps it is indeed time I began to look at this whole matter of bantering more enthusiastically. After all, when one thinks about it, it is not such a foolish thing to indulge in, particularly if it is the case that in bantering lies the key to human warmth. It occurs to me, furthermore, that bantering is hardly an unreasonable duty for an employer to expect a professional to perform. I have, of course, already devoted my time to developing my bantering skills, but it is possible I have never previously approached the task with a commitment I might have done. Perhaps then, when I return to Darlington Hall tomorrow, Mr. Faraday will not himself be back for a further week. I will begin practicing with renewed effort. I should hope, then, that by the time of my employer's return, I shall be in a position to pleasantly surprise him.
BGM 良いだよね。
これはヤクザがリリースされてない BGM だ。これで本は終わりました。一日の残りという本でしたね。誰だったっけ？カズオ石黒さんだったっけ？そう、カズオ石黒。一日の一日の残りというは人生の終わりの夕方ということね。リタイアということは。リタイアはどうやって翻訳？引退でね。そうそう。引退するとこの人生。それは一番楽しみだという結果になりました。人生では後悔はいっぱいあるけど、後ろ向きになればきっと絶望しか見えない。前向きになって希望を目指す。それが一番有効だと言っています。スティーブンスという男、自分の人生に起こったことを語っていました。仕事に夢中で恋愛関係の一つのチャンスを見逃してた。それも再会できてからもう結婚しておばあちゃんになるとこだったのは後悔をなっていた。二人とも悲しいけど嬉しい再会だった。泣きながら別れ。その後バス乗り場でもう一つの愛するとこだった人と出会って仕掛けて人生の悩みを気にするなってということで今日はここまででした。次の本読み配信は視聴者の皆さんの方で質問するからあそこで答えてくださいね。どの本がどのように読ませてほしい。それでは、どこにグレードしようかな。トラッパ君がテストをやってます。あそこに行こう。まったりした後、散歩に行きましょう。いればしてください。その前に最後の歌を歌いましょうね。久しぶりに。ダメだね、ダメよ、ダメなのよ。 あんたが好きで好きすぎてどれだけ強いお酒でも歪まない思い出がバカみたい。皆さん来てくれてありがとう。本読みはよかったかな。次の本読み配信は多分日曜日になるから待っててくださいね。それではトラッパーくんの配信を進入しましょう。